Hello and welcome to our talk, Decolonizing Video Games. We're Antarik Studio, a transmedia collective based out of India, and this presentation has been prepared by my colleague Ami Mehta, a researcher and producer, and myself, Avinash Kumar, a co-founder and director of our project. The work shown here is generously supported by the British Council's India-UK Together Season of Culture, as well as the EPIC Mega Grants program, and showcases a unique partnership that's evolving between Crossover Labs based in the UK and Antarik Studio in India to represent cultural partnerships for the digital age. To briefly touch upon the work that our studio is doing right now, we're engaged in two key projects. These are two different worlds connected by one culture and separated by about 150 years. Antara is a video game adventure set in the late 1800s, while Elsewhere in India is also a rhythmic adventure, but set in the year 2079. Both these projects demonstrate our vision for the future of Indian entertainment, amplify multicultural, plural tradition and heritage, as well as promote non-violent, hopeful, educational and entertaining narratives. Antara is an adventure through a techno-spiritual vision of colonial India that our team has been imagining for the last several years. It follows a mother and her son as they try to conquer the challenges of space travel and aviation. Elsewhere in India, on the other hand, tells the story of Meenakshi, who is an out-of-work cultural cyborg built for cultural preservation, and her oddball crew of audiovisual artists as they remix historical, popular, and speculative culture. Now to the topic of today, decolonizing video games, a heavy topic for a late night. I should say first that decolonizing video games does not really have much precedence globally in the global south and definitely not in India. It is just an emergent discourse. Rules are being made, rules are being broken, ideas are being played around with. And I'd like to submit that me and my team are also students in this larger journey that we're all on. And finally, it's important to understand that decolonizing in a more truer sense would require slow action done over multiple years in a painful manner by practitioners in the global south. Whether they succeed in decolonizing video games or not is a question of time and circumstance. But for now, as a studio, our perspective is that decolonizing should be playful, especially when it's about video games. What we've tried to put together is a small sketchbook for decolonizing video games based on our own reflections and experiences. It's a little bit scattered, but hopefully you'll get something out of it. We're also trying to tell the story of how we got here in some sense over the last decade. And it all starts with challenging the norms of video game authorship. Shown on screen is Jayalakshmi Ishwar, an internationally renowned Bharatanatyam dancer, which is one of the classical dance forms of India. She's an author, choreographer, teacher, as well as the co-founder of Antarik Studio and the original author of the story that has driven our project for the last decade. It's also important to discover unique cultural inception points for video games. Too often video games are made by trying to think about what's cool, trying to look at the internet, and so on and so forth. We were very fortunate that we discovered a dancer and her crew who we could take inspiration from for a story that finally became the work that we're about to show you. On the right, you see is a flyer for a dance program, a small opera that the dancer had created in the year 2010. And this was part of the inspiration that led us to create a video game. It's also important to write your own science fiction. I think this was one of the simple missions that we embarked on when we started Antarik.
In these troubling times, when countries and societies are fighting for the geopolitical conquest of Mars, the solar system, and the entire universe indeed, it is important to recount an alternative view of space travel, one that is but a pilgrimage through the beauty of the universe, carried forth with humility and wonder. These diaries recount the remarkable yet
Make your own games. After writing your science fiction, make your own games. Invest in research and discovery. Believe in yourself. Build your ecosystem first. I guess these are some tips that we might have based on our own experiences in India. What you see on screen is a kind of a fast moving snapshot of various facets of the production that we undertook to make what we call episode 0. This was an hour-long game that I'll just share with you in the coming slides. And this was a 4-year process undertaken by, I guess, a group of first-time game makers coming from different disciplines, bringing a keen sense of curiosity and passion towards a very ambitious challenge. And this is what we made. The next design principle, so to speak, that we've discovered along the way, which could be thought about as a force for decolonizing, is to make it for everyone. Design for a wide spectrum of people, wide spectrum of audiences, design for adaptation and reuse in multiple settings, make it cross-platform, multicultural, family-friendly. These might seem obvious, but these are not decisions that are necessarily reflected in the global game scenario, especially not for the kind of 3D adventure game that we're embarked on for both our projects. It's also important to see that one could take a story and make it for everyone by taking it to different kinds of audiences. So here's a journey to go from retro science fiction inspired by Indian cosmonaut culture and finally landing up in a dance performance for people of all ages. These are photographs from a dance opera tour that we embarked on with the support of Red Bull Music right before the pandemic, which took the work we did on episode 0 of our game and converted it back to a musical dance production. In the effort to think about new audiences, right before the pandemic, we also decided maybe to try our hand at moving away from the 3D format and making a 2D game which could be played on feature phones, could be played all over India, and could be played on low bandwidth settings. And this is an experiment that kind of shows how we were trying to think of the rich 3D world that you were seeing till now and how we were trying to adapt it to a phone based cultural learning kind of an interaction. And what you see here is a game that involves these two automatons, both play Indian classical music, and the puzzle involves learning a few simple musical concepts and solving the puzzles that are kind of embedded inside these automatons. Moving ahead, an essential part of decolonizing efforts in the future, especially in India and the global south, is to include non-traditional creators. What you see on screen is painter Rajiv, who's an out-of-work sign painter from Madurai in the south of India. And these are some of the paintings amongst about 25 to 30 that he's created with us, which will finally become concept cards inside the 3D video game. Being in India provides unique opportunities such as this that can create new and meaningful livelihoods for, let's say, some vanishing arts, vanishing crafts. And it is definitely one of the responsibilities that modern video game creators in India need to have, is how to include non-traditional creators into the pipeline of game creation. We've also been looking at what one could call the circular design of video games. I personally feel that there is a lot to unpack in this, which can have a huge impact on any decolonizing effort. And this is because global video game design and development culture is not necessarily designed circularly. And when I say that, what I mean is that it may not have the ability to hold a digital fair trade provocation. For example, what you see on the screen here is something that we're working on right now, which is an ethical photogrammetry and 3D scanning pipeline looking at connecting local livelihoods in towns and cities around India to fast emerging digital skills in other parts of India, and together to create a revenue sharing model that can help benefit all players in this kind of a pipeline. With this in mind, we've also been working with archives, museums, and collections in India and the UK. And these are two case studies from our work. On the top is an ongoing partnership with the Dakshin Chitra Living Museum in Chennai in South India. And what you see are digitized objects coming from a mix of photogrammetry as well as ground up 3D creation. On the bottom is a self-initiated project with some parts of the public V&A digital collection, and showing how we can take colonial archives of occupations in this case and convert them through a process of digital storytelling and 3D design into virtually living, breathing, talking characters that have a whole lot of applications, such as in augmented reality, in 3D printed exhibit design, in game design, and so on and so forth. Another big aspect of what is important to think about when one works in this domain is that it's very important to think that we have a responsibility as game creators to carry forward the craft traditions of this country. What you see on the screen right now is actually not a 3D scan or photogrammetry. It's a hand sculpted artifact based on photo documentation from South India. It's also important to maintain and respect this difference, because with the worlds of artificial intelligence, new softwares, 3D scanning, and a whole lot of technologies coming in, which will no doubt ease the burden of replicating reality and of creating 3D models, it's also important to understand that there is an art and a craft tradition that is important to preserve, and work such as what you're looking at and pipelines such as this that clearly make the difference and respect digital artisanship for what it is actually a very important aspect of what video games in the future would have to uphold as a responsibility towards the living traditions of this country and of other countries in Asia and Africa as well. It's also important to note that craft is about everyday life in India, and therefore when you respect craft, when you celebrate it, you also celebrate the everyday life, the mundane overlooked heritage, which in effect is maybe one of the most important forms of heritage, even more than what lies inside museums. I'd like to now touch on some of the work that we're doing, which looks at the difficult challenge of representing reality in fiction. And the examples here are from characters, 3D characters that are also called meta-humans in current jargon, or digital humans as the case might be. And here you can see we made a huge leap compared to the work that I was showing you before, where we're getting closer in our project to photorealistic humans. This is the character of the mother and the son before that. And I think one of the huge reflection points here around decolonizing that I've been thinking about is definitely that work like this, technologies like this, offer us a real chance to show Indian video game characters like they've never been shown before, which are not trying to stylize them, not trying to caricature them, just trying to create, in some sense, normal, for lack of a better word, everyday characters that look like the people we see around us. And therefore, it's very important to think about this point, which is that as digital human technology goes ahead, let's increase and heighten awareness and efforts to link these digital humans back to humanity. Our game therefore features real people. In some sense, our game is also a documentary of real people like Jayalakshmi Ishwar, or musicians like Murtovich in the bottom from our project elsewhere in India. Or on the right, these digital humans are embodying real talent from the grassroots, such as Dilruba Saroja, one of the few women artists to play this instrument called Dilruba, as well as practitioners from the temples, from folk and tribal vanishing arts and performances. It's also important to think about what are the kind of identities that we leave behind in this post-human metaverse-like space that we're all going towards. And we've arrived at the conclusion that it's really important for our projects, both of them in fact, to include unique cultural game mechanics which are inspired by the language of Indian dance forms, as well as Indian music traditions and other performative traditions like theatre. For now, our focus is on dance and dance expressions, because this indeed is already a very, very complex task. But it's very important that we think about this kind of a nuance as holding the possibility for creating authenticity in an increasingly banal and monocultural global media environment. Finally, for our last point, I'd also like to point out that in many ways, video games are like museums. And I say this because in a project like ours, as you see the world unfolding in front of you, which is a marketplace in the ancient island of Antara, you will see that level design in a game is very similar to having exhibits in a museum or gallery spaces in a museum. And the process of collecting and curating all the various artifacts that create a 3D world inside a game like this is also very similar to the idea of curating, cataloging, and reinterpreting objects from a museum collection. In our case, this connection is even more deeper, since we are in fact working with museums around the world to create the objects and to create the experiences and narratives that are embedded in this 3D world that you're seeing. Also, this is a prototype for people who are wondering. Then this character therefore is actually not from our game, and the robot following behind him, the mannequin, is also obviously a prototype character. We're choosing to show you some of the process work because this in some sense represents a museum in construction, and in many ways far more exciting than a finished piece. The placeholders you see here are placeholders not just for objects, but also for people, for circumstances, for experiences, for cultural interactions to be embedded. And the world that you're seeing here also, I'm just scrubbing through in the interest of time, is also a world that's composed in many parts. Some of it is heritage and culture, some of it is steampunk, some of it is future technology, some of this is pure fantasy. And it's to see video games as museums, as melting pots for heritage to come and cross-pollinate and create new lived experiences for people and audiences and players who walk through these worlds is our goal. And in many ways, and therefore the challenges that museums face for decolonizing are in fact many of the same problems that a video game such as ours will face. There are also huge opportunities that video games provide to counter and to leverage the ideas that decolonizing might present in front of us. And a huge part of our project is to understand how we can take back that knowledge from video games and introduce it to the museum sector. In conclusion, I'd like to say that we should all view decolonizing as a studio practice. It's not an inconvenience, it's actually a discipline, and it's a discipline that's about everyday work, passion, and commitment to achieving the dreams that you might have. As a practitioner who's worked in the global south for more than 2 decades, I feel like I view decolonizing really as achieving certain outcomes, just as an effort to keep things simple and not only cerebral. I feel like for me and for us as a studio, it is about these three things. It's about reimagining cultural futures through the process of world building in video games. It's about building virtual worlds that can elevate public engagement with local heritage. It's also about exploring digital heritage economies for sustaining art, craft, and heritage traditions. There is also a very grim future looming not so far away, which I believe we should not forget about when we're talking about decolonizing video games. And this is to do with the larger process that we might all be under, which is a larger trajectory of recolonization to new forces, to new paradigms. And I'm sure this is something that we're all aware of. I'd like to point out that while it is useful and meaningful to apply the concept of decolonizing to the video game industry, it is even more important and pertinent to use the power of what is the biggest media industry in the world, which is video games, to use the powers of that to change certain trajectories which are not desirable and to make the world a better place, for lack of a better phrase. Video games have that possibility to be a part of the solution and not to be a part of the problem. The question to ask, therefore, is how might digital heritage provide resilience to future communities through the medium of video games? Thank you for your time. Have a good night.